Do you remember how it felt to be in school? The feeling that you were assigned many projects which you were supposed to be interested in, but which you just weren't and never would be? You may not remember how that felt, because, you're all a bunch of 40 to 50-year-olds or something like that, but I can assure you that school is basically the same, if not worse, for kids today than it was for you. Kids today suffer from a severe lack of intrinsic motivation in school. They're supposed to have motivation to do their assignments because of the prizes and punishments involved in school, the good grades and bad grades, and personal approval and disapproval from teachers and guardians. But I'm here to argue that intrinsic motivation for certain tasks in school will never appear amongst that something a student does not have intrinsic motivation for cannot be cultivated by bringing up extrinsic rewards and punishments for that specific interest or task. And I'm here to expose the problem of intrinsic motivation and also a way to solve the problem of intrinsic motivation in school. The main elements of the problem are a lack of self-knowledge in the curriculum and pedagogy of schools, the overwhelming stress on information work that tells students that they are worthless if they choose to do anything else, and also the internalized grades that many students have psychologically. Tackling the first problem, the lack of self-knowledge, John Taylor Gatto said in a speech that both the severe lack of empathy and the lack of curiosity that children often suffer from in school come from the same root, which is a lack of self-knowledge. It's pretty clear that if you feel like you don't have a defined self and a set of intrinsic motivations, that you will try to replace that sense of inner emptiness with meanness towards others in the case of bullying, that you might try to simply avoid personal closeness with others, because if you get too close to another human being, your own inner emptiness and lack of ultimate purpose will be revealed. And also how a child would not feel interested in learning for learning's sake. In other words, having intrinsic curiosity, because all they've ever been taught to do is to follow the grade, or to follow what their parents and guardians and teachers will approve of. Gatto, from his many years as a teacher, observed these problems and many more, and diagnosed them as all coming from a lack of self-knowledge among schoolchildren. Maria Montessori had a lot to say about this in her famous early 20th century book, The Montessori Method. She observed the way that children were educated at that time, and many of her observations are still very applicable today. She observed that the way students are expected to learn is very similar to the status of many government clerks, as she used in one of her analogies. They sit at a desk all day, processing ideas which come from other people, processing reports and tables of data, and the purpose of all the work they do is not the intrinsic purpose of doing what will support their country and what will make life more tolerable for them and others, but instead trying to get a raise, get a promotion, or simply keep the job they have. In exactly the same way as these government clerks that Montessori's talked about, many children don't do their schoolwork because they like the subject matter and they like using their minds to formulate new ideas related to it. Instead, they do it because they want to keep their grades up, and what they're concerned about is being able to move on to the next level of school, from 9th to 10th grade, for example. A beautiful analogy was used by Montessori when she talked about the difference between a truly healthy child and a child raised under the system of extrinsic motivation. She said, "The jockey feeds his horse sugar to get the horse to run faster. The coachman beats his horse to get the horse to run faster, but neither horse runs as swiftly and beautifully as the free horse of the plains. I want you to think of whether or not a yoke of some sort has been placed upon your children, and if so, whether it's the yoke of prizes or of punishments, of negative or positive extrinsic motivation. Finally, as to the nature of all this prizes and punishments talk, a prize is an extrinsic reward for doing a certain act. In school, the prize would be a good grade for writing an essay. If a student follows the extrinsic reward for writing the essay, they won't write the essay for the pleasure of coherently and beautifully expressing their thoughts on paper. Instead, they will write the essay so that their teacher doesn't disapprove of them, or so that they can keep their grade up and move on and graduate from the year that they're in. In a very much the same way, a punishment is an artificial and extrinsic damage done to a person because they have not done something or not done it well enough. For example, spanking used to be used to try to correct children's behavior as a punishment. Instead of teaching a child that what they did was a bad thing to do because of its own intrinsic nature, children would instead be taught that an act was bad because it was punishable. Without intrinsic motivation, which is like an inner light that guides you to ever greater work, motivated by your own curiosity and intellect, prizes and punishments are like tiny lights in a huge field of darkness, without any inner force to guide you forth in life and to help you grow as an individual. In summary, a severe lack of self-knowledge is what affects many school children today, because they do not have a sense of what actually matters to them. Mostly what they care about is what matters to others, and those standards and those value judgments are expressed through the prizes and punishments of good and bad grades. A second problem in schools today, which leads to a lack of intrinsic motivation, is the overwhelming emphasis on preparing kids for information work and devaluing all other forms of work, like blue-collar and manual work. In his book, Why School?, Mike Rose looked at several blue-collar workers and observed that there were many more and more sophisticated types of intelligence involved in their work than many people in the upper and middle classes imagine. For instance, a carpenter has to use mathematical, aesthetic, and materials/engineering knowledge to construct a new set of windows. He has to know what will look beautiful, what his client wants. He has to know the properties of different types of wood, and he has to know how it will all fit together by geometric ratios and mathematical measurements. In the same way, a waitress will have to know facts like, is the cook in a bad mood, and how will that influence how you should act in the kitchen? What's going on outside? What is the weather like, and how should that influence how you treat customers to give a really pleasant experience? And other facts like, is there a shipment of ingredients that came in damaged, and does that restrict what sort of things the kitchen is making? There are really many more types of intelligence involved in manual work than we suppose. And by choosing to ignore or devalue these types of work, we ignore the fact that some people have intrinsic motivations, or could have those intrinsic motivations, that aim them at manual work. And if we pretend that they're worthless if they do manual work of some sort, we are ignoring their intrinsic motivation, and we are limiting their range of how to live their life. In much the same way as the devaluation of manual work is ingrained in children's minds, in the environment, the socioeconomic environment of Seaholm, a much deeper, ingrained psychological problem among students is internalized grades. In his book Feel Bad Education, Alfie Kohn looks at a survey of several California high schools and other high schools across the country, and found that cheating was most prevalent at the schools which had the most strong emphasis on grades. He found, for instance, that schools that had major valedictorian rules and honor ceremonies regarding people's academic achievements tended to have much more cheating of all sorts, because that sort of culture had taught kids that all that matters is the grade. It had not taught them to look at information for the sake of learning to do it well and enjoy it, which is the key to living a functional life. They have been taught to do what people approve of the most, which is a nice grade on your report card. So, in summary, internalized grades, which is a very deep problem, and probably a very hard one to change in pedagogy, the overwhelming stress on information work above all else, and the overall downplaying of any sort of self-knowledge in school is responsible for the problem of the lack of intrinsic motivation. Now that I've been getting your spirits down for about 10 minutes, it's time to get them back up again by looking at possible solutions. It's good to know that in the form of the Flex program that we currently find ourselves in, a solution to the problem of the lack of intrinsic motivation is already in the works, in the form of Socratic seminar-based education. More on that later. If we want to find a solution to the dearth of intrinsic motivation in school, two main approaches must be taken. We must downplay the role of grades in students' lives so that they cease to see them as markers of the value of a person's life. And also we have to stress the importance of learning self-knowledge among school children. And we have to implement forms of teaching that teach children to learn what's actually inside of themselves and to cultivate the most basic skills that are necessary for all life, instead of going up to a much more complex level, which may involve getting into subjects that some students are simply not meant for. In other words, we have to go to subjects like basic reasoning, which are so basic that they really are not harmful to any person. They're suitable to anyone's intrinsic motivation, and in fact, learning how to reason can only help students find their intrinsic motivation. So we have to work on the self, and teaching the self to reason and to know itself. So about downplaying the influence of grades, Alfie Kohn has written quite a lot on this subject, and he has invented, or at least started to invent, a curriculum, or envision a curriculum, which has no grades and no homework. The advantages of this curriculum are that no homework would give children more time to rest, which would allow them more time to develop self-guided learning techniques and know what's inside of them. And also, it would keep them from viewing the grade as being of cosmic significance. And as a result, within school, children would have nothing before them but the material, and that would stress to them that they should immerse themselves in the material themselves instead of worrying about how they are going to be judged for learning it or not learning it. The article Is Ability Grouping the Way to Go or Should It Go Away? Also has a lot to say about the problem of internalized grades. A study was performed that found that in students who grouped in classrooms who grouped their students into groups based on academic achievement after the grouping was much lower, and the reason for this was that those who did poorly were very much discouraged by being put into groups with other very low-achieving students. The essence of this problem is that the students were taught that how well they had done in the past, the grades they had gotten, were their own markers of personal significance, their own markers of good or evil, basically. They were taught that they could not, they were taught that how well they had done at their subjects in the past had a deep significance to who they were and how they could interact within the classroom. And the article recommends completely ceasing all of this sort of ability grouping within the classroom. For instance, ceasing to do things like seating children within the classroom from front to back by order of how well they do. Things like that should definitely go away, because they stress to children the idea that the grade is what they're worth. And about the problem of, and also going to the second part of the solution, to teach children how to develop self-guided and intrinsic motivation, you have to start very young, because building a child is like building a wall, and a wall will never stand straight upon crooked foundations. So you have to start at birth to get the most growth of intrinsic motivation in a child. The article, The Building Blocks of a Good Pre-K, describes how to start doing this in preschool and possibly part of kindergarten too. They stress the importance of play to young children and how it helps develop socialization skills, literary and mathematical and aesthetic skills, and many other skills as well. For example, letting small children, toddlers, run around in the classroom and talk to each other however they want is a much better way of introducing them to society than having them sit in desks and prepare for college prep tests much later on, prepare them for the testing regime. Unfortunately, of course, this method of play-based learning for pre-K students cannot be extended to higher grades. Eventually, you have to start teaching them actual material. Montessori thought of a good way to do this. For elementary school grades, mostly the younger grades, she advised having a system of pedagogy where students are not forced or compelled to do anything in the classroom unless what they would do without persuasion is clearly evil, like hitting another child. So, for instance, if a child is doing something peaceful or interacting with other students in a benign way, they should be allowed to just keep doing it without any interference from an instructor. The classroom under Montessori's method should be filled with educational objects, like sets of blocks, books, anything that can help them develop the basic skills of life: reading, writing, math, socialization, and so forth. And the instructresses in a Montessori school will walk around the classroom paying close attention to what the students do. And they won't help a child if the child is having trouble, but if the child comes to them and asks them to interact, they will definitely lead the child through activities that are beneficial with whatever object the child has chosen to interact with. So basically, in a Montessori classroom, learning of any sort is not forced upon the child, but it takes place in an environment which is rich enough that children, when you start at a young enough age, will learn by themselves, and that will teach them, hopefully, to keep learning by themselves on into higher grades. However, this structure, Montessori never proposed a structure for grades beyond elementary, and actually more like kindergarten and preschool. Marva Collins, however, the great Chicago educator, had a much better idea for how to extend development of intrinsic motivation into higher grades. For children in elementary and middle school, she devised a program which is based on the Socratic method and on setting subjects up in relationship to each other in a way that makes logical sense. For example, Collins, in a language arts lesson, would present the class with a sophisticated reading selection with abstract topics. She would not shy away from any reading just because it might be considered too complex, because there's no time to start which is too young to introduce children to the full richness of life. And she would lead the class through one of these readings, and then ask them questions which are meant to stress their ability to reason. So within the classroom, the students would have a seminar where they would be expected to back up all their opinions with evidence and reasoning being the most important part. And if a student was not using a rigorous enough argument in their response, she would ask them another, more focused question, until finally she would observe that they backed up their opinion with evidence and a logical chain of reasoning showing why they thought a certain idea about the reading selection was true. In math, a way that she emphasized reasoning power was by setting up math subjects in a way so that each thing would build on top of every previous subject. She would not skip from different levels or subjects of math to each other. She would have everything set up in a way so that everything built on what came before in a clear way. And in that way, students would not be frightened of math and other subjects by not seeing any connection among the parts. This connects to intrinsic motivation because in order for students to further learn how to discover their own intrinsic motivations, they should be taught how to reason, because that is one of the most basic abilities needed in life. And to do that, they need to be taught the wholeness of humanity's body of knowledge, and the fact that no fact is disconnected from any other. There's always a connection between one mathematical fact and another, or a certain idea which you can prove by looking at a reading and a certain other idea which you can prove by looking at it. In this way, children are taught the most basic need of life, which is the ability to use their intellect rationally. The dim hypothesis by Leonard Peikoff expands somewhat on this idea of enforcing the role of reason in a child's life and in their process of finding and developing their own personal life. Leonard Peikoff's main complaint about modern education is that there are too many subjects being taught at the average school. Having 5 classes a day, where you might have a gym class, a science class, a language arts class, and then a couple electives, none of which are related to each other, has a very disruptive effect on the minds of students. He advises that the curriculum should be reduced to just the 4 most essential subjects: math, science, history, and literature. By teaching each of these in the same way that Collins would teach math, showing that each idea is based on is an integration of certain simpler ideas and can be used to integrate into more complex ideas, children could be taught in all the most basic areas of life that reason is essential. And in this way, possibly using the same unforced classroom structure as Montessori, reason and intrinsic motivation could be encouraged to develop in children's lives. So where do we see a system like this? Well, we see it beginning, fortunately, in the FLEX program. The FLEX program uses the Socratic seminar method extensively. This is what actually differentiates us from any other class that we know of. Seminar in FLEX is a place where students are expected to back up their opinions with reasoning. This connects to the need to teach children the basic skills of connecting ideas one to each other in a careful and reasoned way that makes sense structurally. Also, in seminar, you are not made aware constantly of what your grade is, and you are free to speak up at any moment, so you are free to follow your intrinsic motivation in the seminar about what specific topic of each reading or source to talk about. In this way, FLEX helps to develop both intrinsic motivation and reasoning. And finally, connected to Flex and its Socratic seminar method is my service project. I've recently been to the Baldwin Library and conducted a book discussion with a group of 7th to 9th graders, which was a highly enjoyable event. All of the people who were there voluntarily chose to be there, and the way that they interacted with each other and spoke pleasantly, rationally, and in an argumentatively sound way was exemplary of the way in which seminars, and in fact education in general, should take place. What I observed in the book discussion was an excellent range of rational thought about a given source, and I think that if more people took voluntary participation in seminar-like events like these, we could spread the way of Flex, the way of intrinsic motivation combined with reasoning throughout the country and the world. In summary, there is hope to the problem of intrinsic motivation, even though, mostly because of the grading system, it is deeply ingrained into the school system. By looking at what Flex does, and also what Peikoff, Montessori, Cohn, and Collins recommend for what to do pedagogically, I believe we can make a better form of pedagogy which introduces students to the need for self-knowledge, reasoning, and the pursuit of what really makes them tick as children. Thank you.